In the 50s and the 60s, most of Alabama's reefs were dredged up literally for construction material. They went into a lot of roads. Same thing happened in Mississippi, Louisiana. I had a clamshell driveway my entire childhood, and that was normal, or oyster shell driveway.
Welcome to the Eat Y'all podcast, where we discuss the struggles and successes of the farmers, food producers, and chefs who are working to get better ingredients into restaurants today and to ensure their availability in the future.
This episode of the Eat Y'all podcast is made possible by a partnership between Alabama Gulf Seafood and Gulf Shores and Orange Beach Tourism. Check out the show notes to find links to the people and places mentioned in this episode. Welcome to the Eat Y'all podcast. I'm your host, Andy Chapman, and it's great to be back. We had a couple of weeks off, and we were not just sitting around the whole time. We just got back from the EATYALL Chef Camp that we just produced with the fine folks from Gulf Shores and Orange Beach Tourism and Alabama Seafood. And so if you wonder what that looks like, what that entails, stay tuned for the next few episodes because you're going to hear a lot of different parts and pieces of what that meant, both for the fishermen and farmers that we got to see, and also from the perspective of 4 different chefs who were there with us on site for the chef camp. So our first visitor on the podcast is a guy named Joe Ingraham, who is from Admiral Shellfish Company. I've been calling them Admiral Oysters because they have oysters, but they're actually a broader name, Admiral Shellfish Company. And so we're going to visit with Joe and kind of set the stage of what you're about to hear for the next few weeks. We're at a beautiful beach house provided by Harris Properties down there in Gulf Shores and Orange Beach. And we're on the 3rd floor balcony. You can kind of hear the waves in the background. We just put on a dinner with the chefs from Chef Camp for about 35, 40 people, including some of the farms and places we visited, some of the other people from their Department of Marine Resources and Department of Conservation there in Alabama. And some of the folks from Alabama Seafood were there. Some of the folks from tourism were there. And I can't even list everyone because it would take the whole podcast, but it was a really awesome dinner. And we got to visit with a lot of different people, from the chefs that were part of Chef Camp to other partners and people who are in the either seafood world or conservation world that kind of touches the seafood side of things, or tourism, which, let's face it, a lot of people come to the beach to eat great seafood. So it kind of all circles back together there. And our first guest is a guy named Joe Ingraham. He's with Admiral Shellfish Company, and he's going to tell us about what they're doing and a little bit about oysters that you may not have known, and about some of the differences between different farmed oysters. So we're going to jump right in with Joe Ingraham from Admiral Shellfish Company. So we're sitting down in Gulf Shores, Alabama with Joe Ingraham, and Joe is from... Where are you from, Joe? Let's start
from
there.
New Orleans originally. You
like
want to
literally
start back with the family history. Yeah,
straight up New Orleans.
So born and raised in New Orleans and then on the North Shore. And then I came over to Mobile, Alabama for college.
USA?
Yeah, South Alabama. Go Jags.
There we go.
So then got into working at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab, working with marine fisheries, public aquarium, and then eventually in the fish hatchery, working for the state, Marine Resources. So that's my aquaculture background. About a year ago, got offered the position with Admiral Shellfish Oyster Company. So knew a lot about aquaculture. I had to learn a little bit more specifically about oysters. But you're keeping stuff alive in saltwater. It's not too different. So
before we get into exactly what you're doing now,
sure.
What was your, growing up in New Orleans, like what's your pinnacle like oyster memory for being a New Orleans boy?
My dad made sure that we grew up with a deep appreciation for the uniqueness that is New Orleans in terms of all aspects, but especially culinary. So I can just remember putting dozens back raw with my dad, going to the French Quarter, whether it was Acme or any one of a number of different places, just throwing them back.
Throwing it back. And how old were you at this point, Joe?
10, 11. Of course, the very first one, that's gross. That's like snot, and then it was a few years later, tried it again, and I've loved them, really have.
So you're a lifer. How old are you now?
I'm 45.
45. So you're even older than me. So that's 30. Yeah. That's 30 years of oyster practice right there.
Yeah, that's right.
So going back there, and now you're literally farming them. A little different than the tonged oysters that we saw earlier today.
Right.
Before we got to you guys, but talk about this whole farming oyster industry that's happening down here on coastal Alabama, coastal Mississippi, obviously.
So, the entire northern Gulf of Mexico. So, unfortunately, start with a little bad history. Alabama has lost something like 80% of its natural oyster reefs. So, if you came here 100 years ago, the oysters growing naturally on oyster reefs would have been a lot different than what we're looking at now.
And so explain an oyster reef. Like we're literally, for our listeners, you may hear a little whoosh in the background. We're looking at the Gulf of Mexico. Yep. We're on the balcony of a beach house. We got 10 chefs hopefully making something with oysters, seafood, all sorts of things happening downstairs. But when you say oyster reef, as just a guy driving down the road, I don't know what that is.
Right.
Like, you don't see it. What is it, and how does it happen?
You don't see it, and based on our tides, we don't get tides like the East Coast does, where if you were on the water kayaking at low tide, you would actually see an exposed oyster reef. So everything here in the Gulf Coast is on the bottom. But the way what I'm referring to with the oyster reef is, so oysters spawn. And when they spawn, it's floating in the water. The young oysters are basically part of the plankton. So for 7 to 10 days, those oysters swim. You know, everybody thinks oysters are sessile. They just sit on the bottom. Well, for the first 10 days of life, they swim around. And what they're doing is they're looking for some structure to anchor to, and where they grow, and then they grow like what you think an oyster looks like, a bivalve, 2 shells.
So kind of like the barnacles that you see on the side of boats, but oyster.
Right.
It's trying to grab a hold of something.
Think of it like everybody knows, you say coral reef, and everybody knows, the Caribbean, right, Pacific.
The Keys, all that.
Those corals are building, their skeleton is on the outside, and as they grow, they're growing upon thousands of years of other coral skeletons. So historically in the Gulf of Mexico, there's there's hard bottom, but there's not a lot of exposed rock or a hard structure in the water. Oysters need a firm, solid structure for their spat to settle on and then grow. And that was always other oysters. So for centuries, thousands of years, the oysters would spawn, oyster would live its whole life, and then it would die. Well, other oysters had grown on top of it and cemented all of these together into a solid structure. So on old oyster reefs that still exist, you'll go down, and you go down a few feet, and you're hitting fossilized oysters. And then all of the new growth is the upper layers. In the 50s and the 60s, most of Alabama's reefs were dredged up literally for construction material. They went into a lot of roads. Same thing happened in Mississippi, Louisiana. I had a clamshell driveway my entire childhood, and that was normal, or oyster shell driveway. Well, the states have finally figured out that you need those oyster shells back in the water. And I didn't really get to talk about it much, but at the farm, Auburn University has set up, if you notice those pilings that were out in the water.
Yeah, with the latitude, longitude on them.
Yep. So that is for broodstock oysters. They're going to put oysters out with the sole intention of them spawning, and then all of those larval oysters are released in the water and hopefully settle on trying to reclaim lost reefs. So the other thing they do is that the state pays oystermen. So the oyster fishermen that go out and are tonging the oysters off the bottom, in the off season, the state pays them to deploy used or, spent oyster shell with that very intention of rebuilding those reefs. And the reason that oysters are so important, besides being tasty and delicious and the culinary aspects of them, is that one mature oyster filters over 50 gallons of water a day. So when you look at Mobile Bay or, any coastal area, you're dealing obviously with billions of gallons of water. Well, you put millions of oysters out there, you're dealing with millions of water that is being filtered. So a lot of the natural waste and pollution, that's what these oysters do. They clean our waters.
Yeah.
And for, thousands of years, that's been the system that has worked. Man has messed it up, but hopefully we can help correct it.
Did you know that 30 million pounds of fresh seafood are caught off the stunning 53-mile coast of Alabama each year? Alabama Gulf Seafood and Gulf Shores Orange Beach Tourism recently hosted the EATYALL Chef Camp where this episode was recorded. To learn more about Alabama Gulf Seafood, visit eatalabamaseafood.com, and to plan your next culinary beach adventure, visit gulfshores.com. Well, and that's what's so interesting because, as a sportsman, you see like, okay, well, the duck population got overhunted. The deer population got, mismanaged, however it happened. So then it's like, okay, well, like there were no black bears in Mississippi for so long. And then they're a predator for something else. And so there's all these trickle down.
Everything is connected.
It's connected. And so I think that's what's so awesome because you guys, so I heard a rumor that y'all had, I don't know, 1 million oysters in the water or some, I don't know.
Our aim is to be at 1 million. So right now we've got just under 250,000 oysters in the water.
Some of those are the size of your fingernail, right?
Right. Now, so seedlings, we start with seedlings. They're about 2 millimeters. So yeah, the size of your fingernail is a good, general reference for what they start at. What everybody, chefs like we're seeing tonight in the restaurants, what they want with what's called a boutique oyster is they want 2.5 to 3 inches in size. Nobody wants to get a half shell oyster that's 6 inches long and you're trying to slurp down, a quarter pound of raw oyster that's, bigger than your hand.
Right.
So that 2.5 to 3 inch size at most oyster farms is going to take 12 months, 10 to 12 months. With our site, we're finding our first crop is coming online right now, ready for the market. And we're really encouraged. We're thrilled that we're getting a 7-month oyster. So due to our location at Fort Morgan Peninsula, how close we are to the mouth of the bay and the salinity, how salty the water is that we're dealing with, we're super excited that we're going to have a 7-month oyster.
And that's the thing that you hear chefs asking about, like, oh, is that really salty? Is that briny? Or, you hear about, okay, well, those are they're too mild or they don't quite have that punch. And so when you guys were talking about the salinity today, hitting 23 and getting down at the lowest to, 5, 6, whatever,
right.
That's a different thing. I think when people think about farm raised oysters, it's almost like, we just did, 6 episodes on the podcast about beef, and people are like, oh, grass-fed beef is X. Well, grass-fed beef, if you're listening to this, go back a few episodes. We talked to a grass-fed beef farmer in a couple different places, but one of them is feeding them wheat, not wheat berries, but wheat. There's all these different grasses that they're eating that they convert to protein and fat a certain way. Even though it's grass-fed, it depends on what grass you're eating and what the climate is like. And so with you guys having, okay, these are farmed oysters in Mobile Bay, depending on what side you're on, depending on the salinity,
there's
depending
so many
on
variables.
How much chop you're getting in the water,
right,
whether it's protected.
And it's not just a salinity thing, the food availability. So one interesting thing about farming oysters, which is unlike farming so many other things, like if you farm, grass-fed cattle or chickens, you're supplying their feed. Like you're giving them habitat, but you're either giving them the pastures that they need or the right hay, or with chickens, a variety. With oysters, all we can do, we're not feeding them, but by giving them an optimum location that can meet all of the parameters that oyster requires to grow and thrive. So consistent temperature, consistent salinity, food availability. All of those things, like you said, are going to be very different. Mobile, the eastern shore of Mobile Bay, further up near Daphne and Spanish Fort, all of those conditions are a lot more fresher. There's a great differences amongst locations that are all, within 30 miles of each other.
Well, it's fascinating stuff. And I know we did not get to actually pop your oysters out. And I think,
unfortunately,
that's something that I probably want to talk about real briefly, but I was able to get down to Voyagers, a month ago. And a young man named Brody Olive popped some oysters out, and we had them, and they were absolutely phenomenal. And so we're really happy you guys are doing what you're doing, and we're really glad y'all were able to be part of EATYALL Chef Camp and visit with the chefs that were here, because what you're doing is, it's great for the environment. It's great chefs are looking for new ingredients with everything going on in the supply chain, like something that's local and available within however many miles of where we are here, even if it's only 200 miles, That's a lot of chefs that can use this product and really get their hands on it. And that reaches a lot of mouths. And so what you guys are doing is really important, and it's important for the seafood industry as a whole, but also just for, just good ecology and good management of, we got these resources. We should have way more of this. And, you guys are one of how many oyster farms down here?
There's just over 20. Most of those are sort of what you would call mom and pops, where they're people doing it off of their pier at their personal home. Actually, commercially producing, there's less than a dozen of us. But there's plenty of room. And you mentioned Navy Cove. They're a mile up the road from us, and they've been in the business 10 years. They've been wonderful in terms of reaching out, helping us, just offering advice. We've, spent some time working with them and watching their operation. And really, you think you're competitors, but we're all in this trying to grow an industry, because there's plenty of room for more oyster farms,
Absolutely.
And the more oysters in the water, the better it is for everybody.
Yeah, for sure.
And you mentioned us, unfortunately not being able to taste them today.
Yeah, talk about that whole process, because I know sometimes chefs really get, they get locked into an ingredient and then they can't get it that
Don't
one
understand
time.
the availability,
and
right?
they're really frustrated.
And for farmers, that can frustrate us, because so many times it's out of our hands. But what happened last week, they had what's called a red tide, where bacteria levels, triggered past a certain number, where they had to shut the hatchery down, the industry down. So no raw seafood consumption was allowed. So what has to happen for us to have the farm open again is the water itself has to test safe, which it has. The water's been fine for almost a week. But then we have to actually send off oyster samples, where the meat, there has to see if there's the very slimmest chance of any residual effect in the meat of the oyster itself. And unfortunately, that's where we're stuck right now, that we're waiting for the lab results to get back to us to tell us that they're safe. They probably are. And, Scott Bannon, the director of Alabama Marine Resources, he had said in over 20 years of being in the industry in this field, this is only the third red tide that he's ever seen.
Wow.
So things like hurricanes are a lot more common.
Well, a couple of years ago, we had the whole Louisiana let all the water through, and they're
right. Freshwater issues, like farms that they're on the eastern shore of the bay, but above Dauphin Island. This past summer, they lost almost 30% of their crop because the salinity where they were in Mississippi Sound didn't get above zero for a month. So that meant it was completely fresh water. Fortunately, that was our month where we got down as low as 4 or 5 parts per thousand, which makes for a terrible tasting oyster. Like we could sell them, but we wouldn't want to sell them. Right. We would not want that to be representative of our product.
Sure.
Really, at minimum, you need 10 parts to sell. And even then, they're a little bit bland. Like when you taste it, what it should taste like, and then you get one that's coming out of fresher water, you can really pick up the difference.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, Joe, I know we've got 20-course meal downstairs, including some shrimp, crab, oysters. I don't even know what all these chefs have been doing. I stayed out of their way tonight, but it looks like I'm smelling the grill. So I'm gonna let us wrap up. Tell folks how to find Admiral Oyster Company.
So you can go, we have a website, Admiral Shellfish Company. We're on Instagram. To actually get any of our products, we sell through Bon Secours Fisheries. Their website, call them. That's where we're at.
Awesome. Well, thanks for visiting with us. Appreciate it. It's great to have you on the podcast, Joe.
You're happy to be here. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Eat Y'all podcast, hosted by Eat Y'all founder and chief relationship officer, Andy Chapman. If you enjoyed this episode, it would mean the world to us if you'd join us in our mission to save family farms by subscribing and leaving a review. Even better, share this episode and follow us on your favorite social media account at Let's Eat Y'all.